All right, welcome back to the course. We are now in section 3. We're going to talk about using asset bundles. Now, as silly as it may seem, I think that it's actually important that we cover loading assets in Unity and sort of what that means when we talk about assets. So an asset is actually sort of raw materials in the construction of things that you can use in your game. So for example, PNG, which is an image, or a WAV file, which is an audio file, or an FBX, which could be animation data or 3D model data. Unity then converts that asset into an object. That is a game engine representation of that particular asset type. So for example, your PNG will become a texture 2D inside of Unity, and that's something that the engine can then use. A WAV file then may become an audio clip, and an FBX, for example, may become an animation clip, or you could extract the mesh data out of that to sort of fill in a mesh. Let's open up Unity real quick. Let's look at these concepts in application. All right, so I'm back in Unity here, and I have this sample scene set up that is actually a copy of the previous ones we were working in, but I created a new sandbox, and this is called my Asset Bundle Sandbox. So before I move further, I want to essentially create a simple UI here that's going to have a little icon in the top corner, and throughout this section, I want to be able to get to the point where I can load images dynamically into that icon. So let me start by setting up the UI, and in this course, we're not going to go too deep into UI. For that, I encourage you to look at UI course or a previous course, which was hands-on game development for Unity. So let's take a look here quickly how to create this UI. So I'm going to go here to my hierarchy, go to the UI section. I'm going to create an image. By default, this image is centered. I don't want that. I actually want to anchor it to the left. Now, if you just click here and hit top left anchor, it doesn't move anything. It maintains the offset, which is actually what you would want in some scenarios. But instead what I want is I want to set the pivot, and I also want to set the position. So I hold Alt and Shift, and you can see how the icons change when I do that. And when I click this button, it's actually going to move the icon to be in that position. Great, so now it's removed the offsets. My position X and Y are 0. Let me make this a little bit smaller, make this 92 by 92. And I also want to set a slight offset here. So I want it 16 pixels to the right, and I want it 16 pixels down, so it's negative 16. That looks good. So my asset's actually a little bit too small, or rather my image is a little small, and that's because I need to set up my canvas scaling. So canvas scaling is going to help keep relatively consistent across different display sizes. So let me do that now. I'll set this to scale with screen size, and I want to set my reference size equal to roughly what I would use as a sort of a tall phone 1x sort of display. So I will make that 720 by 1280. That looks good. And essentially what I'm saying is that my 1x, my smallest sort of device size, is going to be 720 by 1280. Anything above that is going to scale up with the width. And so it's going to try to keep it consistent as you go, even with higher density screens, which in this case we're simulating an S7 Edge screen, which is 1440 by 2560. So we've got that all set up correctly. The next thing we want to look at is assets. So I have this UI folder that I created for testing stuff out, and I imported some images that I made. Here I have icon A and icon B. Now, when you drop your Unity assets in, by default, they're going to have a bunch of settings sort of assigned to them that you didn't set. That's just what Unity gives them. And you'll notice that these are just images. These are just the raw PNGs. They're set as default. So these aren't exactly what I want. I actually want to convert these into sprites so I can use them in the UI system. So we're going to convert these assets into Unity objects of type sprite. So I'm going to go ahead and multi-select both. I'm going to go to the texture type and change that from default to sprite. And there are a few things that you want to change usually. For example, if you open up advanced, you'll notice that my images actually don't have any alpha. There's no transparency. So I would usually want to turn off alpha source. If it was set to, for example, from grayscale or from texture, that might actually be the default setting. I'm going to set mine to none. And if you want, for example, bitmaps turned off, you would do that here. I highly recommend you turn off bitmaps when you're working in like 2D environments. Bitmap, essentially, you can think of them as creating different quality variants. So you could sort of fade your bitmaps in and out as you go to like farther away or, closer to the camera, that sort of thing. In this case, they're just going to create more memory, and we don't need them because it's 2D. They never change. So we're going to leave that as off. Lastly, wrap mode set to clamp versus there are a few mirror and repeat, and those are used for when you're going to have like a tiling texture. But in this case, I want to clamp it. It's never going to go outside of these bounds. It's never going to repeat or anything like that. Lastly, you have some settings here. So you're going to see that it's going to give me some warnings. POT means power of 2 texture. So that would be a texture that's 2 by 2, 4 by 4, 8 by 8, 16 by 16, 32 by 32, 64 by 64, so on and so forth. In this case, it's 92 by 92 for each one of these, so it's telling me I cannot use the etc1 format. Now, Unity has all the documentation on what that means. I would highly recommend that you check out that documentation on import settings, but keep in mind that you want to be as conservative as you can in the settings that you use for mobile. So I like to make sure that I go into each platform. In this case, I'm going to go to the Android icon here. I want to override the default settings because the default settings may not be great for mobile. In this case, my max size gets set to something reasonable. My size, I already know that it's 92 pixels, so I'm going to set that to 128 just to sort of show you. A resize algorithm, there are two different approaches. You can leave it as the default Mitchell. These are just going to sort of affect how it deals with the pixels that are basically lost if you were to resize it. There's no resizing here because it's smaller than the max size. Compression, right now we can't set it because we have to change some settings. The format is where you get a whole ton of options. Now, I can't go over each and every single one of these, but what you want to know is that they've improved the flow for these, or sort of for example, a Power 2 texture, usually basically going to be forced to use something like RGB or RGBA in the case that you have an alpha or transparency in your texture. In our case, no transparency, so I'm going to go with RGB 16-bit, and I'm not using a lot of color, so 16 is just the color depth. If this was a very complicated image with painting and like backgrounds and that sort of thing, there would be a lot of colors. And so to preserve all that color depth, I would use like 24-bit, for example. So that's 24 bits for every single channel. So in this case, I'm going to use RGB 16. Remember, not RGBA because there's no alpha. And I'm going to go ahead and hit apply. So it's going to apply all those settings. One thing I want you to notice is that a very tiny, tiny image. It's an RGB 16-bit 92. NPOT just means it's not power of 2. And that's basically it here. Obviously, when you have other platforms like PlayStation or standalone or iOS, you're going to want to go in there and set the right things for each one. But again, read the Unity documentation. There's a lot of great information about what is the best texture format to use for each platform and in which scenario. So now that I sort of deviated a bit here from asset bundles, you may be wondering, why are we talking about assets if I want to be talking about asset bundles? Well, obviously assets go into asset bundles. And sort of the point I want to drive here is that when you put an asset in an asset bundle, essentially you're skipping a step. You've already imported these with the right settings for the platform. So Unity is not going to have to re-import the texture on the fly if you're using something like an image from the internet. This may not make a whole lot of sense to you yet. Don't worry, we're going to cover it up ahead in the following videos, so don't feel too lost yet. So essentially, this is how you import assets into Unity. So now that we've talked about that, to get that out of the way, I wanted to lay the foundation, get everything set up so we can talk about asset bundles proper.